Well, I mentioned a couple of episodes ago our friend Bill Jacobson, who with Legal Insurrection, but he has some efforts of ferreting out that stuff. And it's
Yeah.
not only, let's just say, racism in school, which could be in hiring. This could be in scholarships. Here's a scholarship: blacks only need apply, or teachers. You're going to get this bonus, but only if you're a minority. So he has a legal arm there, that goes after that, so, there are
I had a
efforts to.
student tell me, "You don't know what it's like to be Latino." And I said, "I do, because I came of age when this started, and I had in those days, 4.0 was the top, and I had a 3.99. I had 2 Bs. I did pretty well for a country boy in the SAT, so I applied to UC Santa Cruz. Was a new campus. It was harder to get in than Stanford. I was on the waiting list at Stanford and UC, so I might not have gone to college, away, and they let me in, both, I think, much later at Stanford, but I got in at Santa Cruz on the waiting list. So I went there, and there were 2 students from my high school that were C students, and they were there. They were already there. They had been there all summer long they were Latino, and I never said anything, but they could not believe that I had, there were 3 students that had the top. It's a long story, but there was a valedictorian. I wasn't that sally, but we were all 1/10 of a point apart, and I was, I think, the 3rd highest. But the point I'm making is, and then when I went to graduate school, this was in 1975. Mark Edwards was a great guy. He called us in, and there were 4 white males, and he said, "I wanna tell you right now, we are hearing of lawsuits." This was kinda like the Bakke era. None of you are gonna get a job. None of you are gonna get a job. I've been to the American Philological, and everybody's told they're gonna hire women and minorities no matter what. We have to at Stanford. And we said, "Well, you have 3 or 4 women here, and you have an African American." And I said, "How about all you guys? Why don't you all resign and then give your places? You're all in your 60s." When you're that age, 21 years old, you don't believe it. So you thought, well, I told my advisor, I said, "Well, if you're good, you'll make it." I did. I said, "Yeah, but you were in a different generation." So I finished all my exams in 2.5 years. That's all I did. I studied 20 hours a day, slept about 5 hours. I wrote my thesis in my 3rd year. I went to the American School of Classical Studies for a whole year. I did all of that. And when I applied to 17 jobs when I was 25, and I got one interview at the Naval Academy, and they said, "That was a great interview." They interviewed me on everything, "Can you tell us who Jomini was? Can you tell me," and even though it was outside classics, and they said, But you're not gonna get the job. We have to hire a woman." I said, "Well, you guys are kinda old. Why don't you resign and hire her?" 'Cause they have a civilian system at the Naval Academy, not
Right.
like West Point. So I came back and I farmed for 5 years. I was unemployable. I had and they said, when I went to Cal State Fresno, they said, "We're not gonna hire you. We'll have you part-time." And I said, "I published a book." And they said, "Well, let me see. You have a PhD from Stanford and you published a book, but we're gonna hire a woman, a minority." These were all white guys that tell me this. And then finally, I gave a lecture, and the McClatchy person, the foundation, heard me speak. And she said, "That was a great talk. Why aren't you teaching?" I said, "I only have 1 class." And so she gave a gift for me to teach 1 year. And then I did pretty well, and I doubled the enrollment. But my point is, what I'm getting at is there's a whole generation of people that were born in the 50s who came of age during this whole racial preference, and that's all they've known, and all the other generations. So when people say discriminate, there has been discrimination, but when I saw it as institutionally, I'm not talking about what people thought, but institutionally, it was all one way, and people are tired of it. So when I got a job and I got tenure, I had a guy from the philosophy department. He came and said, "They're not going to hire me. They're not going to hire me." I'm a white male. I've been a part-time teacher for 11 years. I make one third of what a professor does. I drive all over to community college. Can you help me? So I went to the chairman of the I did that for about 5 people, and I got all 5 hired. But it was it was very strange, how amoral it was. It was just blatant, you know what I mean? Just blatant, racist. And it
Well,
would have
that
been much better if you thought there was inequality, and there was. If you had started at K through 12, you could have gone down to the kindergarten and said, "These are the types of schools and minority districts in the 50s and 60s that 40s, 50s that educated people well, and we're gonna restore and we're gonna make them academies. And anybody can go, but they'll be located in poorer areas to make sure that when you come out of there," and it was holistic, and that's what I grew up with, is a his in a Hispanic district, and so when I had students, I would always say to them, "You're gonna give a lecture, your class report, you can have no notes. You're gonna memorize it, and you're gonna talk to me. I don't wanna have you read it off, and you're gonna have perfect English," and I corrected their syntax and their grammar, and the whole point that I thought taken was to make sure that Mexican American, Black, Southeast Asian students talked perfect English, were better educated than, anybody.
right.
And then to do all that work, that's why I retired. One day I walked in, you say you're fatigued. I was walking across in my office, and here's this guy had a big Land Rover. It must have been $60. And his office was next to me. It said, "No blood for oil." And then I walked down the argument, and a student came in to the office after me, and this guy who'd been up for tenure was terrible. I was on the tenure committee, and he was telling this student, "You don't look. Don't worry about grammar. You don't need grammar. You have grown up in a disadvantaged. I don't correct grammar." So he was an English professor. So then I saw that, and then I thought, I'm so glad that I don't have to deal with these people, because I had a wonderful colleagues, Bruce Thornton, etc. And I had wonderful students. And then one of the students that I liked a lot, a guy who was really good, came up to me and he said, uh, "Well, I'm applying to PhD programs." I said, "Yeah." And I said, "But it's going to be very competitive because we have 3 people this year with master's degrees, and they have perfect GRE scores, and they know French and German." And he said, "Yeah, but they're not minorities like I am." And at that point, I said, "I'm done." So I turned around and I walked to the PERS, California Retirement, and said, "I want to quit. I want to retire." And they said, "Mr. Hanson, you're 51 years old, and you've only been here 21 years." And they showed me the actuarial tables. We are notorious, they said, for having the best defined benefits, and they were. "And you will be getting 110,000 and at those dollars when you're 35 year." I said, "I can't take it. What would be my?" Well, at that time, I said, "Right now, $18,000 a year when you're 65." They've inflated a little bit because of cost of living, but I said, "I quit." And the president called me up and said, "You can't quit." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you get more hits on your website than we do."
Than the entire school.
Well, I don't know what he meant by that.
But
And I
but
said,
you
"But
also had heavily populated classes also,
yeah,
right?
I
Yeah.
had 200 students, and I had been there for 21 years. I'd written 16 books. I'd won a national endowment, all those things they count. I didn't care much about. I had been a visiting professor at Stanford, visiting professor at the Naval Academy, but I was done, done.